I'm very glad to be joined by our next guest because I'm such a fan of his work. And, I do love any great Princeton connection. I just can't help myself. I just don't know what to do. I think in my mind I'm still a junior or a senior there, even though I know that when I go back for reunions, I'm very old compared to the class that is walking down the hill in what they call a P raid. And I think, I don't understand. Did people still go here after I left? I don't know what happened. There was no frozen moment in time when I left. Okay, well, that's fine. I guess I'll just be old for a second. But I'm talking about S Glaude Jr., who has a phenomenal new book. You know him because he's been a constant figure on MSNBC. He's also a professor at Princeton as well. And he is often discussing racial inequality and institutional racism. And this new book that he's written, which is on the New York Times bestseller list for several weeks over the summer, is called Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. And of course, given our current social and political climate, the viewpoints that S Glaude Jr. shares in this book can be used to dissect what is potentially unfolding right in front of us. I mean, the dismantling of social racism, the Trump presidency. I mean, he has been somebody who has been viewing this world we live in so many different ways. But now it's through the lens of James Baldwin. And this book is part biography, part history. And he makes an argument that we stand on the precipice of a decision about who we are as a country that will most certainly reverberate for many years to come. S Glaude Jr., welcome to the show. I'm glad you're here.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you. And it's always wonderful to talk to a Princeton alum.
Well, I'm so glad that you're here. I'm such a fan of your work. And of course, I should have worn orange, but you can't see it anyway. So it doesn't really matter. Let's pretend I have on orange and black and not a fleece sweatsuit. Let's pretend that I'm dressed up for this as well. And we're on TV, but I have to ask, you've written, your last book was called Democracy in Black, and which is a great book. And it was noted as one of the most imaginative and daring books of the 21st century. And now you have blessed us all with a new one. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to look at the world through the perspective and lens of James Baldwin's America.
Well, I've been reading and studying and teaching Baldwin for a while. For 20 years, he's shaped and informed how I think about the world. And in Democracy in Black, Baldwin is everywhere. He's just not, I'm not engaged in this kind of sustained reading of him. And so I found myself saying, okay, I'm going to write an intellectual biography on Jimmy, right? I got to get him, he's a walking partner. I'm going to just focus on his work and him. But, the world changed. It shifted. And, the country elected Donald Trump. And I kept finding myself saying out loud over and over again, they've done it again, right? And so I was already thinking about Baldwin. And then I realized that Jimmy had experienced a kind of betrayal of his own. That when you think about, him writing in the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King, trying to pick up the pieces, trying to hold himself together in the face of the country's ongoing betrayal, in the face of the rage of Black power, reaching for a different kind of politics, I said, wow, maybe I can walk with him to think about this moment. And so I think he's one of the most insightful critics of race and American democracy that we've ever produced. And so I turned to him in my moment of despair and disillusionment. And as he invited me to do, I looked through the ruins, and I found resources to speak to our moment.
First of all, you're cool, S Glaude Jr., when you can call James Baldwin Jimmy, first of all. I just want you to know.
He's just a walking partner in my head. He's been around for so long in my head.
I'm telling you, you're cool when the friend in your head is James Baldwin. I love it. I love it. But I share your sentiment. And one of the things when you speak about it, calling the after times that we all live in, he lived in the after times. In his case, it was the civil rights movement. And in our times, it's the Obama presidency and the promise of Black Lives Matter. And so what do you note as sort of the juxtaposition when you see how he was talking about the after times? And here we are right now. Is the common denominator some sort of uncomfortable lie?
Yeah, it's that moment when the country has an opportunity to be otherwise, and then it closes the door on it. Like a new America is about to be born, and then, the umbilical cord of white supremacy is wrapped around the baby's neck. And then we have to figure out who we're going to be, what direction we're going to turn. So, to use Robert Johnson's old metaphor, it's a kind of blues, it's a blues crossroads, right? It's an interregnum. It's this moment of transition where an old world is dying and a new world is desperately trying to come into being, but we're making choices to choke the life out of that new world. So I get the phrase from Walt Whitman's Democratic Vistas, right? He's thinking about the country on the precipice of the Gilded Age, after the devastation of the Civil War and the promise of radical reconstruction, right? This country that seems to be soulless. And so what's the connection? It's this moment where America has an opportunity to imagine itself differently, but yet it doubles down on this belief that white people matter more than others. It doubles down on this idea that we are a paragon of virtue as a nation, that this is, in fact, an example of democracy achieved. And so, as you rightly note, we double down on our lies, the lies that protect our innocence and secure our safety, or the illusion of safety, that is.
So it leaves you wondering, in a way, when we talk about what we could have been and then double down and chose not to be, is it us that have sort of ascribed a definition or an optimism or a value system on America that it truly never had? Are we actually just witnessing that it's our own perceptions of what we thought America would be or wanted to be, and in reality what we're seeing is what it is?
Well, it's a combination of both in some ways, right? So there's the expectation, and then there's the reality, and then there's our aspiration, our hopes, right? And there's a sense where all of us have been socialized into the American fantasy, right? That is to say, we all believe that this, is the shining city on the hill. At least most of us do. And I should say that this us here, I'm playing on it, right? Most white Americans do. They believe that this place is, a bastion of freedom, that, it was virgin land, that through merit and hard work, they built this extraordinary nation. And then, we become a mirror to kind of reveal the truth of the matter. Baldwin says in The Fire Next Time, right, that we never believed the myth of America. On page 101 in the vintage edition, right, he says, we never believed in the myth of America, that American men were the most virile, that we treated people justly, da-da-da-da-da. But we had this assumption, this belief that, everything is not settled, that this place isn't what it is for always, right? That we could, in fact, through our own willingness to sacrifice, our own willingness to struggle, right, reach for what Baldwin would call a new Jerusalem. But again, though, it is this illusion of innocence, as Baldwin would say, that is the crime, right? This refusal to confront, to acknowledge what we've done, and our ghastly failures that follow from that. It's like, I'll put it this way, Laura. It's like America sometimes feels like Never Never Land, populated by lost boys and lost girls who refuse to be held accountable, or to embrace responsibility, right? And this sense of innocence makes us monstrous in some ways.
When you're speaking, I'm visualizing and thinking about the sort of the juxtaposition of these two eras. And I'm also remembering when your book came out, the backdrop on which it was released. I mean, we had seen, obviously, over time, far too many people's lives who've been reduced to the other side of a hashtag. We've seen brutality towards Black and brown Americans at the hands of police officers. We've seen the steady assault on voting rights. And we, of course, have seen the idea of people who were once relegated by virtue of civil rights legislation into the shadows, feeling emboldened enough to walk and march down the center of the street, and possibly feeling as though they have an ally in some of the highest offices in the land. And all of this sort of came to a crescendo over the summer when we saw the early parts of the summer, the brutal murder. You mentioned the idea of the choking of the life of the American dream and sort of the visual of a cord around a baby's neck. We saw the devastating murder of a man on the street in my own home state of Minnesota, Mr. George Floyd, and the massive protest that followed. When you were thinking, it was released, when you were thinking about this, and what was your thought when you heard and read the own title of the book about begin again? I mean, how can people begin again? On the one hand, Eddie, I bet people thought, well, God, are we beginning this again? Are we back to where we started? Or is there an optimism to think about, well, here's how we can begin again and have perhaps the trajectory that was never achieved?
Well, I'm never an optimist. This is not, Voltaire's Candide and Panglossian optimism. No, never that. It's a blues-soaked hope. It's what Du Bois writes about in The Souls of Black Folk in the chapter of the passing of the firstborn. It's a hope, not hopeless, but unhopeful. Right? That's B.B. King's Nobody Loves Me But My Mother, and she could be jiving too, So the idea is that, the country is what it is, right? The country has failed repeatedly when it comes to this question. And part of what we have to do is realize that it's not us, that the problem isn't us. This is the revolutionary inversion at the heart of Jimmy's writing, right? That I've never been the N-word, never thought of myself as the N-word. The question is, why did you need the N-word in the first place? So I'll give it back to you, baby, as he puts it, And so, when I saw those horrific 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and I was asked over and over again on MSNBC to talk about it, to have to put it in context with what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, to what happened with Breonna Taylor, and then later, of course, Jacob Blake. And, the list goes on and on and on, right? I found myself reaching for Baldwin, reaching for, his evocative description that, our communities are policed like we're still under the slave codes, right? And so part of what I wanted to do was to kind of tell the truth, to bear witness to the suffering, to make it real, right? Because, you get in these moments, and you hear it all the time, right, that when this stuff happens, white folk clutch their pearls, and they go, oh, my God, is this America? I can't believe this is us. We're 2020, and this is who we are? And you kind of look at them, and you say, well, what country have you been living in, right? So part of the beginning again work is not about reaching for an optimism, right? It's actually, Baldwin writes that, I get it from his last novel, Just Above My Head, and it's a moment in the novel where he's describing that the dream has shattered. They've killed King, and people have lost their minds. Some people are dead. Some people have just simply quit the country. And then he says, but responsibility is not lost. Responsibility is abdicated. If one refuses abdication, then one begins again. Remember, I'm in despair, and I'm full of disillusionment. This country has done it again. So I'm trying to figure out, how can I push this damn boulder up the hill again? And how can black folk muster the energy, right, not to fall into a deep kind of cynicism, a despair, right, and figure out how, to keep fighting. And it's in that moment where the language begin again, right, resonated. So it's not about a guarantee of the outcome. It's about, even in the midst of the darkness and the failures, we can't abdicate our responsibility. We still have to fight for a new Jerusalem. We still have to fight for a better world for our children and our children's children.
We still have a choice. I mean, even in the after times. And one of the things I think it's so poignant about using the lens of James Baldwin is that many people don't realize they can cite his works, they can reference his quotes oftentimes, and yet they don't necessarily realize that in the years spanning from the publication of The Fire Next Time in 1963 to No Name in the Street in 1973, he was transformed into a more overtly political writer. I mean, it came at great professional and personal cost. By 1972, he had survived 2 suicide attempts, and his work, although lauded extensively now, was criticized a great deal, but yet he still had a sense of a renewed purpose, and he pushed forward through that disillusionment and despair. And in many ways, here we all are right now in 2020, days away from a critical presidential election. Many people feeling that same sense of disillusionment and despair. And yet one of the things you write about in Begin Again is this idea of recognizing that we still do have a choice, and that which is right now doesn't have to always be that way. And so I wonder, I'm curious about the process you took when you wrote this book and the way in which you approached your research and the prism by which you wrote. What was that like for you as you started to figure out, and how can I understand and explain that what I'm feeling?
It was hard. Baldwin has over 7,000 pages of writing, right? So there's a lot there. And he's intimidating as a figure. So if you see yourself as a writer and you want to write about him or with him, he could run you over. He could bulldoze you. And so I had to figure out how to keep my back up, to keep my spine, right? Not to try to imitate him or to just simply, mimic his formulations, right? So I've been teaching him. I taught him throughout the 2016 election cycle. I taught him afterwards. I was reading with my Princeton students from, all of his nonfiction, from Notes of a Native Son all the way to The Evidence of Things Not Seen. So I had a good idea of my particular reading of Baldwin. I knew that I couldn't write an intellectual biography alone because the archive is challenging, because a lot of the material has been embargoed for 30 years. And so I had to figure out, what I was going to do. And it didn't come to me, until I was in Heidelberg, Germany, when I saw those police officers all the way over there, 4 of them with their knees in the back of a black man who was screaming at the top of his lungs. I ran back to my apartment and I just started writing furiously. And it was there that I found the hook, that I wasn't writing about Jimmy, that I was going to write with him about our current moment. How did he muster the resources, right, to respond to the country that was, open to the civil rights movement and black power, and then the country that ended up electing Ronald Reagan? So how would I respond, the country that said, that we had turned the corner with the election of Barack Obama and then ended up vomiting up Donald Trump, right? So I had to kind of sit there and really find the confidence to write with him. And that was a challenge because it required, in some ways, Laura, me dealing with my own lies, dealing with my own vulnerabilities, because it's a precondition to say, Baldwin makes it a precondition that whatever you have to say about the world, you need to first examine yourself. And so I found myself drinking a lot of Jameson.
And were you able to answer the question that you pose in the book, Begin Again, and this idea of who do we take ourselves to be and what we must ask and do in order to call forth the new America?
Well, that question of who do we take ourselves to be is always a question that is open-ended, right? We can't take ourselves to be these virtuous, pristine persons, right? Baldwin says that the trouble is deeper than we wish to think because the trouble is in us. And until we confront our ghastly failures, we will never be able to build that kind of human community that affirms the dignity and standing of every human being. So when I say, who do we take ourselves to be, it's really a kind of question that aims to provoke us to engage in the assessment of our past. But you see, right now, even in this current moment, you see in real time the reassertion of the lie. Folk just want to tell a lie. They don't want to confront who we are. So what does Trump do? They ban, racial bias training as un-American. The OMB memo. Or he starts the 1776 project over and against the 1619 project. Why? Because we don't want to tell a story where Americans are not the heroes and heroines, right? We don't want to tell a story where we actually confront, the bitterness at the bottom of the cup that is the life that we live. So, how do we answer that question involves an honest reckoning with what we've done, and we have to tell the truth. It seems to me.
What role does trauma play, though, in memory? I mean, what part of this I think to myself about, we've got the idea of the esoteric and the questioning of and the thought process, but then I also think to myself, one of the things that can often interrupt sort of the logical thinking is the fact that there has been a great deal of trauma experience, and that is baked into the memory of people of color in this country, that can make it very difficult to ask these questions, to answer them, or to engage. What role should it play?
Well, it's at the heart of Begin Again, because the spine of this book is No Name in the Street. And No Name in the Street, as you rightly noted, was published in 1972. It's the first book published right after King's assassination. And it's a book of wound and trauma. It's a book of where he's trying to give an account, right, of what has happened in this compressed period of time. And so it is structured at the level of form, like fragmented memory. He misremembers, to use Toni Morrison's language, right? An event can trigger a return to the past. It's constantly folding back in on itself, right? And so what I'm trying to do in Begin Again is to think through No Name in the Street, because the trauma is here. You remember Professor Nell Painter, and she wrote a wonderful essay entitled Slavery and Soul Murder. And what she was trying to suggest is that, people who study slavery and who study child psychology never want to attribute an interior life to the child who experienced the brutality of slavery. She's saying there's no way they could come out of this hole, right? Just witness, their families sold. And Baldwin would even go so far as to say there's something that's happening to the slave master who knows that he's selling his child at that moment, right? And so there's this sense in which trauma haunts, right? Even in Charlottesville, right? Here we have these folk, we will not be replaced, these tiki marches and screaming neo-Nazi bile, and then Heather Heyer gets killed. We don't even have time to grieve in that moment because Trump is coming down the escalator within the next day. It's like King gets killed, Bobby Hutton is killed. We can just go on. Right after King is murdered, there's the murder of young Bobby Hutton in Oakland with the Black Panther Party. We can go down the line, right? So we don't have time to grieve, and that trauma haunts our politics. I think what I was trying to do in the book, and it has everything to do with the way in which I'm engaging Baldwin, is to foreground it, right? Because we're not supermen and women. We're not Marvel characters, right? And so when I say they did it again, right? There's a snarl on my face. There's rage in my eyes. There's pain in my heart. That I got to watch my son make a choice. Dad, I got to go protest. I know COVID is out there, Dad. I got to go protest. Look what they did. And then he has to choose to risk his life again. You know what I mean?
It's almost like a new version of a freedom rider, the choices of knowing that you could at any moment be in peril, but the choices that need to be made. And this is a constant theme throughout this book. I mean, it is superb. And I desperately wish that I could return to school now and, of course, learn under who is the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, S Glaude Jr. How fortunate they are to have you. But we're all able to be students of yours through all of your texts, including this latest one, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. And I hope that people will read it and revisit it, because there are going to be times, as you know and can predict, within the next 15 days and 30 days and 15 months and 15 years, where we are going to have to, as a nation, begin again. And how we choose to approach it could make all the difference in the end. What a fabulous book. Thank you for being a part of the show. It's an honor to talk with you and to learn from you. And I'm strangely so soothed right now. I'm very, very calm, and yet I have this desire to make sure that people realize the urgency, and how often do we want to step on the rake that then hits us square between the eyeballs? We really have to think about this through that lens. So S Glaude Jr., thank you for your perspective and for writing with James Baldwin. It really was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and you take care. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.